Welcome, everyone. My name is Chad Simmons, and I'm an ecologist here at the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that MTRI is in and we are meeting from Guestwick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, homeland to the Mi'kmaq people. We acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship, and we'd like to thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So for anyone unaware, MTRI is a research-based nonprofit, and we are nested in Southwest Nova Scotia near Kejimkujik National Park and Historic Site, and within the Southwest Nova Scotia Biosphere Reserve. Our mission is to promote, conserve, and sustain biodiversity in Guestwick as well as beyond. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Andy Kekacs. He is the Executive Director at the Nova Scotia Woodlot Owners and Operators Association. Andy completed his Master's of Environmental Science at Dalhousie University in 2017. And if I can say so myself, a very good university. And he has a background in communication, managing nonprofits, and is an award-winning environmental writer. So next, I'm going to hand the seminar over to Andy. But before that, I'd like to remind everyone to please keep your mics muted. And if you have any questions during the talk, you can type them into the chat and we will answer them at the end during the question period, or you can ask them live as well. So with that, Andy.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you to MTRI for inviting me to speak here today. I really appreciate it. I'm so compliant. When Chad said you need to mute your mic, I reached over to mute my mic, and that would have been pretty ineffective for this presentation. But I didn't do that. So I'm the executive director at Nova Scotia Woodlot Owners and Operators, and a little bit of background about that is probably worthwhile. We were founded in 1969 as an association of forest landowners and small contractors, which is what the operators are. And in the past 30 or 40 years have really taken a leading role in advocating for forest practices that are more respectful of natural processes, to boil it all down, really. Over a long part of that time, NSWOA, as we're known, was viewed skeptically by many people in the sector, and so when the Leahy report came out, the independent review of forest practices in Nova Scotia in 2018, and essentially said what we had been saying for most of 30 or 40 years, it was a good day. It felt good, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all of that today. Yeah, it's a big topic, and I understand that I've got half an hour to run through basically 13,000 years of forest evolution and politics and economics. So we'll take a pretty quick brush at it, and then hopefully have some time for lots of questions. Let's see. The first big bar here is trying to get my screen shared, and let's see, that should be it. And with luck, let's see. There we go. Hopefully everybody sees a full screen of the first slide in the presentation. So my outline for tonight is to tell you a little bit about my personal goal, give you some cautions, spend very short amount of time on the rise and decline of big paper in Nova Scotia, some of the impacts of the pulp era in the province, the roots of change, which finally blossomed with the Leahy report, as I discussed, a little bit about what we understand about where natural processes might suggest we want to move practices in Nova Scotia, and then how a group of organizations, which I just learned today is actually maybe the largest undertaking for small woodland owners in the Maritimes ever, the largest single project to move forest practices in the Maritimes ever to have been. So we'll talk a little bit about that. My goal is really simple. This is a hard subject. It's very complicated. People who say they know the answer are full of baloney. I will try to be as accurate as I can be, and I guarantee you that in the interests of trying to be clear and simple, I will make some kind of small mistake. I won't do it on purpose. I'm not sure that that's true for everyone else in this debate. But what I really hope that you'll get out of it is a bit more understanding about how our forests work, and a bit more courage, really, to say, well, why do you think that? Why do you believe that? What's the basis for your statement? Because that's really what we need to do as a society around this difficult and contentious issue. Yeah, enough of that. So as I said, forest policy is complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces. When I was a business writer, which I was in the early part of my career, I met folks that were stock analysts on Wall Street, that were industry analysts, and they were so sure they were the smartest people in the room. It was very irritating, frankly. They were sure that there could be nothing higher than trying to understand the function of the markets and the impacts on the economy and so forth. And I'd have to say that every logging contractor, every farmer, and every fisherman who goes outside in Nova Scotia every day to try to balance weather and economics and biology and all the other things that they balance every single day faces a far more difficult task than any of those extremely wealthy stock analysts that I once used to talk to. So dendrology, economics, weather, diseases, and this whole list that you see in front of you, all can play a role in our thinking about how to manage forests. And the question is ultimately, what does society want to get out of our forests? What do we need to get out of our forests? How should we treat our forests? And that should really be a key determinant of how we think about what the right path, if there is such a thing, might be. I guess, I don't know. I started as a competitive shotgun shooter, and the difference between a shotgun and a rifle really simply is a shotgun produces a pattern. So at 25 meters, if you got most of the pellets in a 30-inch circle, that's good enough for a shotgun. And a rifle, of course, you're trying to hit the bullseye. I don't think there is a bullseye for forestry. I think there's a 30-inch circle. And I think that, practices can fall within that circle. And many of them may at times fall within that circle. But then there are things that are clearly outside the circle. And that's my oversimplified view of what forestry is, I think. Just a really quick thumbnail about the pulp era. It started almost 100 years ago. It started right in Brooklyn in Southwest Nova. Isaac Walton Killam started the Mersey Mill. And a number of years later, in '62, Port Hawkesbury Mill opened, and followed a short time later by what became Northern Pulp. By the time all three of those mills were in full operation, really the entire system of forest management and harvesting had evolved to produce chips for the mills. That doesn't mean that we weren't making other products, but as the supporters of Northern Pulp made a really compelling case for that when they said, everything would fall apart if we didn't have Northern Pulp. I mean, the whole industry was really built around the significant purchases of wood chips by the three pulp mills, now down to one, of course. In the mid 2000s, the industry was consuming 6 million cubic meters of wood annually, and that's fallen to about 2.5 million cubic meters the last time I checked. Unsure if that was the latest figure we have, but it's approximately the latest. Also, the three mills once had 2,000-ish jobs directly associated with the mills. Right now, I believe Port Hawkesbury is claiming around 325 workers at its mill, which would be the last remaining one in the province. So for essentially 50 years, when we finally had the equipment that allowed us to conduct forest management on a large scale and cut a lot of trees quickly, which only occurred probably in the mid 60s and later. For about 50 years, we emphasized increasingly a forest management paradigm that favored the growing and harvesting of small diameter softwood trees. We did certainly cut dimensional lumber out of those, but the lion's share of that volume, I believe, went to wood pulp. Forest policy in that era was almost single-mindedly focused on current economics, and the long-term economic, ecological, social, aesthetic, and virtually every other measure impacts on the forest were given little consideration, to be generous. In 2017, I guess it was, former Premier McNeil asked William Leahy, who is the president of King's College in Halifax, to take a look at the situation as it stood in Nova Scotia. And Leahy took about a year and assembled quite a team and released his independent review of forest practices in Nova Scotia in 2018. And the conclusion he reached bears repeating here, although I suppose most of you have probably heard it a lot, which is his conclusion was that environmental, social, and economic values should be balanced by forest practices that give priority to protecting and enhancing ecosystems and biodiversity.
About this one too.
I'm sorry, I'm getting, Richard, I'm getting your mic into my, could you mind? Thank you. Enhancing ecosystems and biodiversity, and that they're the foundation on which the other values, including the economic ones, would ultimately depend. The pulp era had significant impacts on forest stewards. You should know, if you don't, that family forest owners, small owners, about 33,000 of us, control about 52% of the working woodland in Nova Scotia and about 60% of the standing timber. It's very clear that the survival of the sector depends on small landowners, but a decreasing percentage of them have been willing to sell wood. Woodbridge Associates looked at that issue for the province in 2011 and said as many as 1/3 of the folks who were once selling wood into the forest economy in 1997 had stopped by 2010. My take on that is that we had abundant research, beginning with Peter McQuarrie, longtime Department of Natural Resources researcher, really. It identified as early as 1983, I think his first study was produced. The work may have been done a couple years earlier, that folks were having increasingly complex conceptions of what they wanted to get, goals for their forest land, and that current income was declining in importance. And over the next 40 years, that finding only increased. It's become more and more fixed in landowners' goals. Of course, we can't generalize. There are 33,000 landowners, and there's a lot of different goals. The research I did into that topic, which resulted in a thesis at Dow in 2017, said that while people had a lot of different goals, almost all of them were focused forward, so that I might be very interested in building a nest egg for retirement, but for me, that retirement might be some years off. Others might be concerned about passing a place down to their children, or to having a family place where we could recreate and enjoy ourselves over the next several decades, and so forth. Many people were concerned about wildlife. Other people were concerned about access to actually the wood that we needed to have products, over time. So complex and different goals, but many of them focus down the road. So essentially legacy goals. Important fact that went ignored for the longest time, as our pitch to landowners and our programs for landowners really focused on trying to give them short-term incentives for taking actions that perhaps they were reluctant to take. Excuse me. Astonishingly, the beginning of change, in addition to Macquarie's finding, the beginning of change, I think you can point at pretty clearly, was 1983, when Murray Prest, who I believe at that point still owned a sawmill in Mooseland. He was, I believe, a former president of Forest Nova Scotia, filed a brief with the Royal Commission on Forestry, 1983. So a solid, 35 years before Leahy. Murray, who I did not know, who's said to be quite a colorful character and perhaps a little bit strong-willed, had basically set himself against pretty sharply the prevailing thinking about forestry at the time. Several statements out at the brief is really quite astonishing. It pretty much hits all the things that Bill Leahy said. I won't say that Murray was 100% right, but he was more right than anybody else who said anything in that era, near as I could tell. It's quite interesting. Let me know if you want, I'll send it to you. It's worth reading. So among his highlights from that brief were that indiscriminate clear cutting, short harvest rotations, planting without soil, testing or fertilization, destruction of the remains of the forest, and herbicide use were going to be a problem in the future. No surprise there for those of us who are in the future and look at what we're talking about today. In addition, he ultimately suggested the same thing that Leahy did, was that we should work with natural parameters, within natural parameters, to balance our needs with what the forest can naturally, reliably, and reasonably provide. And then he went on to say something even more provocative, I think, which is that the illusion of forestry through reforestation, so essentially through clear cutting, the fallacies of genetically improved species, the blackmail of wildlife versus old growth, and so forth, were frankly not being given enough consideration, and that public dialogue was a much greater and more robust public dialogue was needed in order to adequately come to some kind of decision about what the right course was. So, Murray, I don't know you, but you're a pretty smart fellow back along. You probably have heard of his nephew, Wade Prest, who also is in Mooseland, gets in the paper from time to time, was a member and was a director and is still an active member of our association. And Wade apparently had come out of school at UNB, the forestry program, right in that time that brief came out. And he thought Murray, in that instance, in that time of his life, he thought Murray was wrong, was dead wrong. And he realizes now that, or at least in his opinion, that Murray was entirely correct. So what are these natural processes in the forest, right? We can't really follow them if we don't know what they are. I would identify at least two things that are really important. The average gap size. So how much of the forest, how large an area of the forest is opened on average when there's an opening in the forest. There's a fair amount of work that's been done on that, and the consensus, which is built around, I'm sorry, I'm not going to come up with the number of studies, but many, many studies, both in the Wabanaki Acadian forest and also in what they call the Lake States forest in north central US, put the average area of forest, the average gap size in the pre-settlement forest at around 1/10 of a hectare or 1/4 of an acre. So very small gaps. Essentially, a tree gets killed by insects or disease or old age, and it creates an opening as it falls. And that was, in fact, the way mostly succession occurred in the pre-settlement forest. And that's a wonderful thing to know, but it's not the whole story. Because if those gaps are small, but there are many, many, many of them across the landscape, then we could still have a forest disturbance pattern that might be quite significant. However, there weren't many of those gaps. The bottom line is that the average area of forest disturbed annually in our forest was around 1%. So basically, there were small gaps, quarter of an acre or less, and in fact, most of the studies were significantly less than that, quarter of an acre or less, about every 100 years. So dramatically different than the openings and the sizes that we see now in Nova Scotia's forests. And the conclusion that Bob Seymour reached, and others in a 2002 paper, and Seymour was an advisor to Leahy, as you may know, works at the University of Maine. If the goal is to emulate most northeastern natural disturbance regimes, then we really need to be under continuous canopy, multi-age silviculture that maintains ecologically mature structures. That means big old trees at a finely patterned scale. Okay, so that's really important to know, right? I mean, this is what our forest would have looked like if we hadn't adopted different practices, to put it simply. Some people will talk about wind, some people will talk about fire. The fire incidents, it generally was quite small in the pre-settlement forest, and the return intervals, so how often did a piece of ground burn? So where you're sitting right now in the forest would have burned once every 806 to 3,000 years based on studies that were done. So not really common fire. And a similar, I think a longer duration for wind events. And these are from studies all across, it's not just Maine, but all across the forest that I described. I think the wind returns were on the order of some huge number up to 14,000 years. So essentially, once you get beyond 500 or 600 years, you're already beyond the lifespan of individual trees. And so it becomes almost meaningless. So all that's really good to know. Small gaps, infrequently. But if we do things like that, can we obtain from the forest some economic value while still protecting the ecological characteristics that the natural forest has? And Saunders, working also in Maine at Penobscot Experimental Forest, the reason you read a lot about that is it's the oldest continually operated forestry experiments, I think, in North America, but certainly in Eastern North America. They've been doing this since the 1950s. So there's a lot of data there. Saunders and others looked at the question about whether forestry that was built around natural disturbances, like we just described, would actually succeed, if you will, in both protecting the ecological characteristics and producing reasonable economic returns. And their conclusion was that it would. Yeah. I mean, that was it. That's the simple conclusion, that volume yields would approximate and financial returns would approximate all conventional, even and uneven age silviculture systems. So everything out there, the whole suite of things that we might do in the forest, this was not necessarily better nor worse than them. Enough said, I think. So viable, small disturbances, small areas. And so that got folks like NSWOA and some of their partners. Mercy Tobiatic Research Institute is one of them. Also in Southwest Nova Scotia, Western Woodlot Services Co-op, the community forest, Medway Community Forest, and a couple of folks who live there but represent province-wide organizations, got together shortly after Leahy's findings were released, I would say within a week or two, and we looked at them, and we all had, some concerns. But we all thought that if we could move the needle on 60% of our forests, if we had brought more natural forest practices, more natural forest condition, healthier, diverse, resilient, larger, older, forests, that whatever other concerns we had were outweighed by the value in essentially recreating a natural forest on most of the landscape. So we did a joint letter for the first time to Premier McNeil, said we think this is just wonderful and we can't wait to help. It took DNR some while to think about how it wanted to approach that question. And to be fair, I mean, it was a huge change. They were fairly heavily invested in the old paradigm, and many of the folks who were there at the time were fairly heavily invested. But eventually DNR began to make changes, and you're aware of them because they've been in the paper. But Leahy did not make recommendations on small private lands. And we thought, knowing what we did about our members and about what research tells us that small landowners want, we thought that perhaps we ought to get ourselves moving, right? We ought to take on the job ourselves. So in 2020, 11 organizations that serve family forest owners, actually, it wasn't 11 at the time. Let me not exaggerate. It was 7.
Sorry, I'm just going to get this up here.
Megan, would you mind muting yourself, please? Thank you. 6 or 7 organizations that served 11 landowners at the time put an application into the Forestry Innovation Transition Trust, which was also established by Premier McNeil in the aftermath of the Northern Pulp closure with a $50 million endowment. We put in an application to create a province-wide project, all of those things really, to implement ecological forestry practices on small private lands. It took a while. There were a lot of proposals for funding. In July of 2021, FIT brought several of us together who had made proposals relating to small landowners and said, hey, can you get together? And the specific quote was, can you tell us what the long vision is for forestry in Nova Scotia? What's the long vision? And we hadn't thought about it quite like that. We had some opinions about, what we'd like to see changed as we understood it. But they said, think about the whole thing and give us a solution. And so when all was said and done, we had 11 organizations because most of them joined in with us, and a wide-ranging proposal. The key element of which, however, is a large-scale pilot of ecological forestry. It'll take place over 5 years and involve around 200 woodlots throughout the province on a variety of stand conditions and soil types. Treatments will be designed by a team of researchers and replicated several times. All of those things you look for in a high-level research-based investigation of how we might implement the treatments that have been proven out in other areas, but implement them in a Nova Scotia context. I know that last spring, the Biodiversity Act got a lot of debate going here in Nova Scotia. And I want to be clear that the pilot that we're doing will only work with willing landowners who volunteer to participate. This is not a government-imposed mandate. This is a program that arises from small landowners and their desires to be able to achieve their goals for ownership. In addition to volunteering, the stands in which we operate must meet selection criteria that independent researchers, which we'll hire, we haven't selected them yet, and the Nova Scotia foresters who are part of our steering committee members will create these criteria for lots that will be part of the pilot. Sorry, it's been a heck of a week. Any of you folks who have worked with provincial and federal funding will know that the last 2 or 3 weeks of the fiscal year for them is something between a nightmare and a free-for-all, and it's been that way for us. Not that we're not glad to do it, but it's challenging. So anyway, the pilot will show, as Bill Leahy said, how forestry is best managed and practiced in Nova Scotia within an ecological forestry paradigm. I mean, it's exactly what he suggested we needed to do. Boy, you know, this is challenging because all of your faces are on the side of my screen and you cover half of the things that I'm trying to tell you about. So anyway, we intend to demonstrate that there are ecologically preferable and economically viable alternatives to the industrial forestry paradigm that we've followed for 5 decades ish so far. And we intend to quantify the economic, environmental, and social benefits and costs. And out of that project to produce recommendations that are built around real evidence about those things for conducting better management in a wide range of forest conditions on small forest ownerships. This is not an easy change. For those of you out there who are contractors, who are foresters, who are mill owners, who are looking at this and are just flummoxed, frightened, angry, we understand that this is a significant change in how a portion of our land base will be managed. Significant reinvestment in time, training, equipment, and so forth, and particularly in the forest is needed. Contractors in particular, I mean, you need to understand that many contractors in the province are millions of dollars invested into equipment that may not be ideally suited for the kind of forestry that we're talking about. And therefore, this is a really daunting thing. We understand that. We want to reach out to you and to hear your concerns. And we want to incorporate you into making this pilot the best it can be. However, that being said, the first step really that we have is to acknowledge that there are biological limits to what we can get out of the forest, and that Bill Leahy suggested that we needed to be mindful of those. We believe that's the most important thing of all. That's really all I had for formal remarks tonight. I have no idea how we're doing for time. And I still don't know because my phone's decided to shut down, but I imagine we have plenty of time for questions. So you can learn more about ecological forestry on our website. You can sign up to get updates on what's happening in the Family Forest Network at that web address, and you're always welcome to send me an email. I'm usually great about it. I'm going to be out of province on vacation for a bit, so I may not be entirely prompt. I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter that I need to see that I've never met before because of the COVID restrictions. And frankly, nothing's going to stop me from doing that. But I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So questions? And thank you for your time. This is always one of those situations where you say, wow, I either did the very best job. We answered every single one of the questions that those folks had, or wow, did you just blow it? Everybody has fallen asleep, and the best thing you can do is call Tim's and have coffee personally delivered to each one of these people.
Oh, we have a question in the chat. Oh, no, everyone's saying you did a really great job, Andy.
I have a lot of folks that I know here, and I know that some of you have got some. Dan, I do see your question. That's a fine question. Unfortunately, there's no answer to that right now. The first job that we have is to hire researchers to sit down with the foresters to design the treatments and the research parameters. That will happen, just as soon as we have a contract signed. We did get an approval back in late September, but we've had some negotiations about the contract with the province, and we're, I think, on the cusp of getting it signed, but not quite there. So with any luck, end of April, we'll start that work, and there'll be a large update at that Family Forest Network mailing list. So do sign up there, and you'll hear more as soon as we can really say. I saw something from Bo, I think, as well. Let's see if I can look at that. Holy smoke. See, this is one of the good things of COVID, right? We're all at least a little bit more technologically savvy. Yeah. So again, Bo, it's the same answer, I'm afraid, right? We will be looking for specific stand characteristics that would be, forest condition, soils in a wide variety of places across the province. And I suspect that those conditions, I mean, if I was the researcher, those conditions would be the ones that would be most likely to result in forest improvements across the widest number of hectares. But they're not really, they're not designed yet. So I really can't answer you.
I believe John Brasner has his hand raised too, Andy.
Oh, John, great. Do I have the capacity to recognize John or no? Let's see. There we go. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
I'm fatigued, but you know this because you work for the province.
I definitely learned some things tonight. It was a really interesting presentation, so thanks for taking the time to put it together at this time of year. I get the feeling, I know you don't have all the details of how you're going to do the 200 different woodlots, how you're going to design things, but it sounds like maybe you're interested in working with independent researchers rather than working with anyone from the province. But I just wanted to put it out there that we are very much in the planning stages of trying to work on the biodiversity impacts of different forest prescriptions. And so we would be a potential partner if that was something that Family Forest was interested in working on. But I also, just one other technical question is, I can't imagine you're going to work all 200 sites in this first year. You talked about a 5-year unfolding of this. So is it something like a fifth of the sites in the first year, and then rolling that out over the next 5 years? The treatments that would be incorporated would happen over that 5-year period on 40 or 50 woodlots or something like that?
Yeah, it'll average that, but we'll mostly spend the first 6 months answering the questions that you and others have asked, right? Which are the key questions here. So we'll do, I suspect, 8 or 10 treatments later this year, almost as a pilot of the pilot, if you will, and then get cranking and ramp up over the next year, and then be at a little over 40 for the last 3, 2.5, 3 years. Yeah. John, thank you also for that offer. We look forward to being able to work with the province. We do have one person from the province on our steering committee, but we would love to have you involved in the biodiversity area where this person is not that's not their area. So yeah, let's do it.
I know my manager Tara Crew has met with you in some form or fashion in some of the online meetings, and she's definitely interested in all this. So the possibility is there. Just wanted to throw it out there.
That's great. Yeah, I've had great conversations with Tara. She looks like she's going to be a real asset. So yeah,
she's fantastic.
Yeah. I see a half a question from Tom Rogers, and Tom, did you give us another whack at that, or there it is
later in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So to keep it as simple as possible, the Working Woodland Trust was one of the several projects that FIT received. And when they said, what's the long vision and could you work together? Mary Jane Rogers said, well, yeah, of course we can work together, as did we. And so the Working Woodlands Trust is receiving funding through that allotment from FIT as part of the Family Forest Network. So we are ardent supporters of their work, and However, they're hitting the ground running. They were well underway, and you may be aware that they're moving. A smart fellow would have gotten the web edge. I don't have it. It's easy enough to find. I believe they have a site, Working Woodlands Trust, if you're interested in more information. If not, just write to me and I'll get you connected up. Let's see, was Mike next? Yeah, he was. Hello, Mike. How's things? Have you determined the parameters? Yeah. So that's a bit of a challenge, right? That's a really good question. A proposal that we're looking at now would look at past outcomes from treatments, as well as currently applying some industrial treatments as part of our project. That's challenging, right? Because some of the folks on our committee would say that we've had a lot of experience with industrial forestry, and that therefore spending more money on it was not a wise use of funds. I think it's more complex than that. And I don't know that we want to tell. Let's, you and I, when we have that coffee, let's talk about that. But it will certainly involve looking at the history, the long-term history of outcomes for intensive forest management and investment in Nova Scotia. And as you may know, that investment has been significant, in the area of $200 million over the last 20 years. And the outcomes have been mixed. So it'll be interesting, however we decide to go forward. Yes, absolutely, Cloud. The projects are throughout the province, and that's essential as far as I'm concerned. We're delighted to have the Cape Breton Private Land Partnership and the Landowner and Forest Fiber Producers Association in Port Hawkesbury join with us in this, and really just very happy to have them. But we do have now the capacity to deliver services and to conduct pilot treatments throughout the province. Let's see. Yeah, there will be, David. David asks about reporting. So a really critical component here is evaluation and reporting. Often lacking in these kinds of projects, right? We anticipate a significant amount. We anticipate annual reports. We anticipate a final report. We very much hope that there will be several graduate degrees that are built around this work. And so we expect research papers to come out of this and so forth. If there's not the robust publications and also a really incisive evaluation, then we will not have achieved what we should have achieved. So since we intend to succeed, there will be. Bo asks about mountain biking and recreation and small scale logging. That's an interesting question. So, and he asks further, can we include projects that are sort of hybrids of more than timber management? I don't think those things are incompatible. I don't think we necessarily want to study the other uses of the forest, but could our pilot treatment sites occur within places where other values predominate even? And I don't see why that would be a problem. That's attractive. I'm not sure we've thought about that in precisely that way. That's a great question. And I think that would be a good thing. Disturbance produces diversity. Well, can produce diversity. The question for us, of course, is what did what did the forest look like originally? And originally, the forest didn't have the size of the disturbance or the magnitude of the disturbance, the area that is disturbed, that's anywhere near the scale of the disturbances that we see presently in the Nova Scotia forest. And so if our goal is to manage more according to natural disturbance regimes, then it would be unlikely that we would manage at the disturbance levels that we're currently seeing. I guess that's the only way I would be able to say that. Other questions? Gosh, somebody feel free to speak right out and tell me that you don't believe any of this baloney. That's great. We can go there if you need to. Also, I don't know that I'm able to see everybody's hands. If anybody has a hand up that that isn't getting called on, let me know. I think not.
No, I don't see any more questions, Andy.
All right, great. Wow. Good stuff, really good stuff, really important issue for our province, profound impacts on what it will be like to be a Nova Scotian in 20 and 30 and 50 years. I encourage you all to stay engaged. Will it be easy? No. Will it be frightening? For many people, yes. Yeah, we're going to do the best we can with this project, and I think it'll help. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that very well-rounded presentation. And I really enjoyed how you opened it up with that context of kind of how forestry has changed since the European contact. That was great.
Thanks.
And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And you can join us again next month on Thursday, April 28th for our next Sit Back seminar, when we will be joined by Samantha Beal from Dalhousie University. And she will be presenting on developing environmental DNA as a biodiversity monitoring tool using Atlantic whitefish. And as always, you can stay up to date with our seminars by following us on Facebook. And if you'd like to watch tonight's talk again, you can check out our YouTube channel. So with that, we hope everyone stays well, and we get to see you all again very soon. Thank you. And thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.